The man known to history as Heinrich Müller was born on the 28th of April 1900 in the city of Munich, in the region of Bavaria in southern Germany. His parents were poor Catholics from Bavaria, his father working as a rural police officer. Müller consequently attended a state-run Volksschule, where he received a fairly rudimentary primary education, before taking up an apprenticeship with a mechanic when he had barely entered his teenage years. Little else is known about his early life, and Müller remained a man whose personal affairs were largely inscrutable throughout his life. Müller was entering his teenage years at a tumultuous time in European history. The continent had been drifting towards outright conflict between its great powers for many years. Two armed alliances, consisting of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy on one side, and Britain, France and Russia on the other, had developed, fueled by rivalry over naval supremacy between Britain and Germany, for dominance of the Balkans between Austria-Hungary and Russia, and over colonial possessions in Africa between every power. And now, in the summer of 1914, a regional diplomatic crisis in the Balkans following the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo by a Serb nationalist, quickly ballooned into a full-blown European showdown. Over the space of a few days in late July and early August, the great powers declared war on one another, with the conflict soon involving nations from beyond Europe, including Japan and the United States. The resulting conflict, known as the First World War, would last for over 4 years. The Central Powers were led by Germany, and the worst of the fighting would take place in the trenches of northern France on the Western Front, eventually ending in defeat for Germany and its allies, and victory for Britain and France in particular. Despite his very young age of just 14 at the time that the war erupted in 1914, Müller saw active military duty before the conflict came to an end in November 1918. His training as a mechanic had led to him specializing in aircraft maintenance, a burgeoning field at the time when air flight, of even the most rudimentary kind, was little more than a decade old. As a result of this expertise, he was drafted into the Deutsche Luftstreitkräfte, the German Air Force, during the latter stages of the war. He saw active duty on the Western Front in northeastern France in 1918. His role in this was as an attaché to the artillery spotting unit at a time when observation balloons, as well as basic reconnaissance planes, were still being used to determine where artillery units should aim their fire across the trenches, a necessity for artillery units, which could fire several kilometers but could not see what they were aiming at across no man's land. His service was well regarded, and by the time the war ended, he was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery, and also the Bavarian Military Merit Cross for his service. Thus, he left the army in 1918 with honors, and was somewhat unusual amongst the future senior ranking members of the Nazi regime in not carrying a lifelong bitterness about how the war had ended. Like many other former soldiers in Germany in the late 1910s and 1920s, Müller found himself drifting towards the Freikorps in the aftermath of the war. The Weimar Republic, which had been established to govern the country following the collapse of the German Empire, had been commanded under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the war to an end, to demilitarize and decommission the vast majority of its troops. Thousands of soldiers now joined the Freikorps, or Free Corps, a German paramilitary organization of military volunteers, which had existed in Prussia and then Germany as far back as the 18th century. In the period immediately after the cessation of the war, the new republic was beset by communist unrest as the German communist movement, buoyed up by the success of their brethren in Russia since 1917, sought to seize power in the very country which Karl Marx had originally conceived his communist utopia for. The Freikorps were deployed in large numbers countrywide in 1919 and 1920 to crush such communist agitation, and Müller was active amongst them and saw active duty with the Freikorps in crushing the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic, which established itself in power in Munich in April 1919. Müller's involvement with the Freikorps and his family background in policing, his father having been a police official in Bavaria, led him into the same occupation in the early 1920s. He rose fast and was soon advanced to a senior position within the political office of the Munich Police Department, and it was owing to his involvement in Munich's policing that he would first come into contact with Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, though somewhat ironically, given his later role in the Nazi regime, which would come to rule Germany, his initial encounters with them was as an opponent. The Nazi Party had been established in 1920 out of the German Workers' Party. It had emerged as a political party for right-wing German nationalists, who favoured a type of workers' revolution based on opposing communism. Its membership was largely comprised of veterans of the war who were profoundly disillusioned at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had been negotiated by the Weimar Republic, viewing it as a stain on German honour. The party attracted support from veterans in Munich in the early 1920s, and under its leader, the Austrian Adolf Hitler, it had soon risen to have tens of thousands of active members and tacit supporters throughout Bavaria. Müller would have been fully aware of the growth of this subversive group within Munich in the early 1920s as a result of his police duties, but this loose interaction became altogether more serious in the early winter of 1923. On the 8th of November that year, approximately 2,000 armed Nazis attempted a coup d'état in Munich with the goal of seizing control of Bavaria and then marching on Berlin to overthrow the Weimar Republic. But the Munich Putsch, or Beer Hall Putsch as it became known, was a complete failure from a military perspective. On the morning of the 9th of November, it was quickly broken up by German army detachments which had been deployed in Munich, and Müller was amongst the Munich police officers who were involved in investigating who had been responsible in the weeks that followed. Admittedly, Hitler and several of the other senior commanders needed no investigating, and after a quick manhunt, he was captured in the Bavarian countryside a few days later. Yet his trial provided him with an opportunity to broadcast his views to the German public, and he would only serve 9 months of a 5-year prison sentence, which he received. Ultimately, the most striking thing about the Munich Putsch is that the Weimar Republic failed to take advantage of the episode to crush the Nazis when they had the opportunity to do so. For Müller, his involvement in the police investigations which followed the Munich Revolt of 1923 ensured that in the 1930s he was mistrusted for years by many senior Nazis. Following this, his activities in the mid to late 1920s and into the early 1930s are again rather unremarkable. He continued his work as a police officer in Munich, activity which was in itself somewhat significant in the long run, as Müller was studying the methods being employed by Soviet-Russian police organizations, notably the OGPU, or Joint State Political Directorate, the senior secret police organization within the Soviet Union between 1923 and 1934, and the forerunner of the NKVD and the KGB. Through his work, Müller became attuned to the latest surveillance methodologies available to secret police agencies in Europe, and familiarized himself with how totalitarian states could monitor huge numbers of people in order to maintain power and stifle political dissent. These were methods he would put to use himself in later years, in his role as head of Germany's own secret police, the Gestapo. For the meantime, in the 1920s and early 1930s, he was using such methods to better surveil communist organizations in Bavaria. Müller appears to have developed a striking antipathy to communists, or what were increasingly referred to as Bolsheviks in Germany, after the Russian Communist Party. This antipathy would fuel much of his work with the Nazis later. Though Müller spent much of the late 1920s and early 1930s in relative obscurity, there were wide-ranging changes occurring in the wider country. After nearly a decade of rapid economic growth following the First World War, the global economy had overheated and crashed badly in 1929, the so-called Wall Street crash. A Great Depression followed it, and this hit Germany especially badly. Millions of people lost their jobs and fell into poverty. Life savings were wiped out, and basic foodstuffs and goods became difficult to afford. And in this environment, extremist political parties gained ground on the more moderate establishment parties. In particular, the Nazi Party, which Müller had encountered back in Bavaria in 1923, exploited German resentments about the post-war settlement in this new atmosphere of economic turmoil. They were soon gaining widespread support throughout the country, and by 1932, this was translating into nearly 40% of the vote in the Reichstag elections held that year. This declined to under 35% in early 1933, but a deal with the leaders of German industry allowed Hitler to become Chancellor at that time. And within weeks, the Nazis exploited their new position to begin outlawing all other parties and forming a one-party totalitarian state. In this manner, the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933. Müller's political views did not entirely align with the Nazis during these years. He was a member of the Bavarian People's Party, or BVP, a conservative pro-monarchy party which favored Bavarian separatism, but which was willing to work within the confines of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. The BVP was also a staunchly Catholic party, and this probably also appealed to Müller, whose political outlook at this stage was grounded in his roots as a Catholic Bavarian. Indeed, he was not alone in this perspective, and the party was consistently the most popular in Bavaria during the Weimar era. Furthermore, it held regional power in Bavaria, at the time when the Nazis gained control in Berlin, early in 1933. Germany, then as now, was a federalist state, where power in regions such as Bavaria was devolved to a considerable extent to local administrations. As such, the BVP Minister-President of Bavaria, Heinrich Müller, exercised considerable regional authority in Munich in 1933. But he was quickly challenged by the Nazis in February and March. Müller committed his second transgression against the Nazis at this time by proposing to Müller that he militarily resist the Nazis' efforts to overthrow the BVP. Müller, though, declined to do so and resigned from office. The power of the Minister-President of Bavaria was subsequently stripped away, and the regional autonomy of Bavaria was completely subordinated to Berlin. Thus, by mid-1933, Müller found himself in a precarious position. He had twice, once in 1923 and now again in 1933, found himself in a compromising position in relation to the Nazi Party, which had now taken control of Germany. He might have expected to be removed from his senior position within the Munich Police Department and blacklisted as an opponent of the regime, but he was to be saved by an unlikely patron. Despite his compromising role in the Munich Putsch, Müller had caught the eye of Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi security service, or SD for short, which had been established in 1931. In 1933, the SD and the SS, headed by Heinrich Müller, began taking over the police services of the former Weimar Republic and Nazifying them, and they began in Munich, where Heydrich became aware of Müller's skills in advanced surveillance techniques. After determining that he could be useful, the head of the SD decided to take Müller under his wing, rather than purging him from the Munich police. Indeed, Müller was quickly promoted, becoming a senior inspector by the end of 1933. Müller, for his own part, was willing to adapt to the new situation as a man who has been characterized as extremely malleable in his beliefs, and one who wanted to progress in his career above all else. Müller's career thereafter in the 1930s and beyond was intimately tied to both Heydrich and the Gestapo. The Gestapo, or Geheime Staatspolizei, which means the secret state police, was created in April 1933 by Hermann Göring. It was originally confined to Prussia, the largest federal constituent state of Germany, which made up much of the north and northeast of the country. However, its remit and areas of operation quickly expanded. On the 20th of April 1934, Göring handed over control of the Gestapo to the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, and 2 days later, Himmler named Heydrich as head of the secret police, and its remit expanded to cover the entire country. Under Heydrich's leadership, the Gestapo became a specialized police service, often staffed by academically gifted investigators, rather than rank-and-file police officers. Müller was quickly brought on board, and by 1936, he had risen to become operations chief of the Gestapo, effectively making him Heydrich's second-in-command. And yet there was a paradoxical element to this. Although he had joined the SS in 1934, Müller did not join the Nazi Party, and indeed an official report on him from the mid-1930s by a Nazi official noted his dubious relationship within the party in the past. Despite these complications, he continued to be promoted in the years that followed. Müller's work within the Gestapo covered many areas of German life under the Nazis. Early on, the secret police was particularly active in crushing political dissent against the Nazi regime. This focused on German communism and the trade unions to a very considerable extent, and it was Müller's long-standing work in prosecuting communists in Bavaria in the 1920s and early 1930s which made him especially useful within the Gestapo during these years. Throughout the mid-1930s, the Gestapo surveilled and often arrested former trade union officials, the unions themselves having been largely broken up in 1933. These efforts culminated during Müller's early years at the Gestapo in the breaking up of the Markwitz Circle. This was a group of moderate socialists that had established ties to former members of the Nazi Party, who had been pushed out by Hitler in the 1920s. Much of the Gestapo's methods at this time focused on the policy of protective detention, whereby individuals of suspect political allegiances were detained and sent to the concentration camps which were springing up around the country. Here they were held indefinitely for protracted periods of time, without having charges actually placed against them. Other groups which were monitored within what was known as Department A for political opponents within the Gestapo included reactionaries, liberals, and intellectuals. Müller had a particular antipathy towards the latter. Religious organizations were also closely scrutinized by the Gestapo, and Department B was tasked specifically with monitoring the same. Bishops and other senior members of the Roman Catholic Church were monitored particularly closely by the Gestapo, not least because they had political allegiances which lay outside of Germany itself, in the Vatican, in Rome. Other groupings which Müller was charged with monitoring included those sections of the media which had managed to maintain some independence from the increasingly dominant state-run media, headed by the Minister for Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels. Finally, the Gestapo also oversaw the monitoring of people's personal lives and any activity which was considered offensive by the Nazis. For instance, in 1934, around the time that Müller was drafted into the Gestapo by Heydrich, a special office was set up to identify and monitor gay and lesbian people in Germany. In the years that followed, thousands of gay men and some lesbian women were identified and arrested, often being sent to concentration camps where many died or were sentenced to hard labor. Müller's personality was well suited to work of this nature. Not only had he developed advanced skills in surveillance and other secret police methodologies in Munich during the 1920s and early 1930s, but he was also naturally disposed to the tasks he was charged with in the 1930s. Müller was a workaholic, one who several other senior Nazis remarked upon as always being available to take their calls, day or night, 7 days a week. In part, this may have been driven by his home life. In 1924, he had married Sophie Dischner, the daughter of a newspaperman in Bavaria, and they had 2 children, a son, Reinhard, who was born in January 1927, and a daughter, Elizabeth, who was born almost 10 years later in September 1936. Elizabeth was born with a physical impairment, the exact details of which are unclear. After she was born, Müller's family life became very strained, and his contemporaries in the Gestapo and other security offices uniformly noted that Müller's marriage was unhappy and that he never appeared in public with his wife and children. Moreover, several individuals attested after the war that Müller was perpetually in the office, returning home only to sleep, it seemed. In addition to being a workaholic who wished to avoid his home life, Müller was immensely ambitious and driven to advance himself in his career, an ambition which seems to have been his primary, perhaps even his sole, drive or motivation. Furthermore, his politics were otherwise completely malleable, and it is very hard to discern what he actually thought about any issue, other than what he might gain from it and how he could amass further power and influence within the Nazi regime through it. In actuality, his only really discernible personal views during this time at the Gestapo did not involve any affinity for Nazism, but rather his loathing for communism, a trait which emerged during the formative period of his life in the late 1910s and early 1920s, whilst working with the Freikorps and the then police service in Bavaria. Above all, he was a meticulous administrator, the kind of imaginationless bureaucrat who could operate in a world of surveillance, torture, and persecution, if he felt it was lending a sense of balance and regulation to a society. Contemporaries were struck by his ability to spend hours or even days passively questioning suspects until a crack in their defense might show. Müller became involved in 1938 in a power struggle within Germany, which had major implications for the direction of the country's foreign policy. The Nazis were determined to dismantle each of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and rebuild the German military or Wehrmacht to the point where war could be initiated to build a greater Germany, one which would cover much of Central Europe, as a first step towards conquering Eastern Europe in order to obtain Lebensraum, or living space, in years to come. However, despite Hitler and the Nazis controlling the state apparatus, the Wehrmacht retained its independence to a considerable extent. Many of the generals who considered themselves the successors of the old Prussian military, rather than being Nazi commanders, had substantially different political outlooks to Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, Goering, and other senior Nazi leaders, and several of these were opposed to the rapid remilitarization of the country and the plans for an inevitable war with Britain, France, and Russia. Foremost amongst these obstinate commanders were the War Minister, General Werner von Blomberg, who was critical of Hitler's plans to initiate a European war no later than 1942, and the Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces, Thomas Werner von Fritsch. Müller became central to their removal. What has become known as the Bloomberg-Fritsch affair began in the opening days of 1938, when it was discovered that Erna Grün, a woman whom von Blomberg had recently married, had posed for pornographic photos many years earlier and had been suspected of being a prostitute. When this came to light, Hitler exploited the scandal to force the war minister to resign. Plans were now initiated to dig up similarly compromising information on von Fritsch. Müller was charged with undertaking this work. In the days that followed, information was collected which suggested that the commander-in-chief was homosexual. This was based on a report compiled within the Gestapo offices which actually concerned a cavalry commander, Achim von Frisch. The false allegations, combined with further insinuations that von Fritsch had been involved in discussions about launching a military revolt, were enough to force his resignation in February 1938, though he was later found to have been falsely accused in all respects. Nevertheless, Müller and the Gestapo had done an effective enough job that Hitler could now establish greater control over the Wehrmacht, and with the appointment of the compliant Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel to oversee the army in the aftermath of the Bloomberg-Fritsch affair, Hitler was able to establish greater control over the German military. The Bloomberg-Fritsch affair and the removal of the more skeptical elements within the German army occurred at a time when the Nazis were accelerating on their march towards war. Ever since seizing power in 1933, the Nazis had been becoming more and more aggressive in their foreign policy. No sooner had they established themselves than they began incrementally rebuilding the German army and the air force known as the Luftwaffe in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in March 1936, another core part of the peace was breached, when the Rhineland was remilitarized. Under the terms of Versailles, this region, which bordered France and the Low Countries, was supposed to remain almost entirely empty of any German military presence. Things escalated from there. In March 1938, Austria was annexed, while just months later, the Nazis also sought to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia in 1938, and were duly allowed to do so by the Allies, who believed they could still appease Hitler and the Nazis at that stage. Then, in the early months of 1939, the rest of Czechoslovakia and Hungary were formed into puppet regimes. Eventually, on the 3rd of September 1939, in response to Hitler and the Nazis' invasion of Poland 2 days earlier, Britain and France finally declared war on Germany, signaling the commencement of the Second World War. Müller was central to the outbreak of the war. In the summer of 1939, it was not clear that the invasion of Poland would finally spark the war. Hitler and the senior party members believed that if intervention in the country could be justified in some fashion to the international media, then maybe Poland too could be occupied without a wider war breaking out. This would provide an even longer window for the regime to continue building up its military forces. As such, it was decided to invent a justification for invading Poland. Responsibility for this was handed over to Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller in what was called Operation Himmler. This would be a false flag operation, which would seek to provide a justification for a German invasion of Poland by staging several alleged Polish attacks on German border stations and officials around the same. For one of these, Müller personally had several prisoners removed from Dachau concentration camp, dressed in Polish uniforms and killed, and their bodies were then planted at a German radio station at Gliwice on the Polish border, and a story was concocted that these individuals were Polish soldiers who had been killed during an attack on the station. This false flag operation was carried out on the 31st of August. Germany invaded Poland the next day. Müller's role in Operation Himmler was a boon to his career advancement at exactly the right time. With the outbreak of the war, a decision was taken amongst the senior Nazi membership and the heads of the various security forces to consolidate the Gestapo and other police organizations under a new umbrella organization, named the Reich Security Main Office, the idea being that this would centralize the security apparatuses throughout the growing amount of German territory in Europe and create greater efficiencies. As well as this, Heydrich was now promoted from his post as head of the Gestapo to become head of the new Reich Security Main Office. Despite his suspect political past, Müller's role in creating the basis for war with Poland and Heydrich's patronage was enough to ensure that he was appointed to succeed as head of the Gestapo. To ease his promotion, he also finally joined the Nazi Party in 1939, a belated action which highlights the strange situation he was in, whereby somebody who rose to such seniority within the regime seemed to be a very tepid supporter of the Nazi Party itself. In addition, Müller was promoted to the position of Oberführer, or senior leader, within the SS. As a result of these promotions, Müller became one of the most senior figures within the German security apparatus. Only Himmler and Heydrich were more senior. As head of the Gestapo between 1939 and the end of the war in 1945, Müller was responsible for discovering and suppressing opposition to the regime. His particular skill in this regard, honed since the 1920s, focused on identifying threats connected with the Soviet Union and communism within Germany more generally. A notable episode in this regard was the identification of the Red Orchestra in 1941. This was a broad circle of communist sympathizers based in Berlin and elsewhere, which distributed leaflets and posters promoting socialist values and civil disobedience within Germany. This involved figures from within the officer class of the Army and Air Force, as well as members of the German judiciary, such as Harro Schulze-Beusen and Arvind Harnack. These people were not really connected in any substantive fashion with the Soviet regime in Russia at all, but suspicions abounded within the Gestapo that they did, and were planning something more sinister following the German invasion of Russia in 1941. Having discovered the extent of the group in 1941, they were kept under surveillance by Müller for months, before mass arrests were initiated from the autumn of 1942 onwards. By the spring of 1943, well over 100 individuals had been arrested, and the orchestra was broken up. In the early 1940s, the range of areas where Müller was operating expanded considerably beyond Germany, though police work within the home country always remained his primary duty. Following the outbreak of war in September 1939, Poland had been conquered and occupied by Germany in a matter of a few weeks. Months of inaction followed throughout the winter and early spring of 1940, so much so that many began to talk of a phony war in Europe. But then, in the late spring, a rash of conquests were undertaken. Denmark and Norway were quickly occupied by German troops from April 1940, and then, in May, the conquest of the Low Countries and France was undertaken, in a whirlwind campaign, which brought much of Western Europe under German control in the space of just 6 weeks. Early 1941 then saw Hitler aid his Italian ally Benito Mussolini in Italy's conquest of the Balkans, while the invasion of Russia from June 1941 onwards brought a huge expanse of land covering Ukraine, Belarus, and much of Western Russia under German occupation. As these meteoric conquests occurred, Müller found himself dealing with a range of matters outside of Germany, particularly those regions of Central Europe, in Czechoslovakia and Western Poland, which were being most closely assimilated into the German Reich. No sooner had the war broken out than Müller found himself increasingly involved in the regime's policy towards the Jewish population of the lands under German control. The Nazis were rabidly anti-Semitic, and domestic persecution of Germany's Jewish community had been underway since the party first came to power in 1933. Throughout the pre-war years, this had largely focused on politically disenfranchising German Jews through measures such as the so-called Nuremberg Laws of 1935. These prohibited marriage between Jews and Germans and restricted the employment and economic opportunities of Germany's Jewish people. The laws also effectively robbed German Jews of their citizenship. Much of the purpose of these economic and political sanctions was to coerce the country's Jewish people into emigrating, either to the Middle East, where Jewish people were trying to establish their own communities in the Holy Land, or else to countries such as Britain and the US. And this intensified in the months leading up to the outbreak of the war, most notably on Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when state-organized attacks throughout Germany led to the death or serious injury of hundreds of German Jews, and attacks on thousands of Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues. Müller was heavily involved in this episode, and was the individual within the Gestapo who oversaw the arrest of upwards of 30,000 German Jews in association with Kristallnacht. Yet, as bad as this persecution had been in the pre-war days, Germany's Jewish community was relatively small. With the conquest of Eastern Europe in the early years of the war, where a majority of Europe's Jewish people lived during the early and mid-20th century, millions more Jewish people ended up under Nazi rule. In tandem, the Nazi state's persecution became more and more intense from 1939 onwards. Already in January 1939, with the annexation of Austria and other lands in Central Europe, the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration had been established in Berlin, with a subsidiary office already having been set up in Vienna in the autumn of 1938. Its objective was to expand the policy of forced migration of Jewish people, which had been in operation in Germany throughout the 1930s, to the newly acquired territories in Central Europe. Heydrich was appointed to oversee the Berlin office, and Adolf Eichmann was his counterpart in Vienna. The Central Office's area of operation would expand significantly in the years that followed, particularly into Poland. and Müller would play a key role in the functioning of the central office, first as Heydrich's deputy and then in his own right as head of the Gestapo. At first, the increasing persecution of Europe's Jews centered on more intense efforts to force mass migration. Figures such as Himmler, Heydrich and Müller were largely overseeing these efforts. As early as October 1939, Müller was supervising initiatives to relocate tens of thousands of Polish Jews into ghettos in cities like Warsaw. In this, he collaborated closely with Eichmann, the individual within the Security Service, or SD, in Poland, charged with overseeing policy towards the Jewish people in the conquered country. Again, forced emigration remained the preferred tactic to reduce the Jewish population of Eastern Europe at this time. But there were millions of Jews in Eastern Europe, and the war had severely disrupted migration routes. Consequently, Nazi policy began to coalesce in 1940 around an outlandish scheme championed by Eichmann to transport Europe's Jews to the East African island of Madagascar, where a kind of giant open-air prison would be created. However, this plan was abandoned in the course of 1941 as it became clear that Germany would be unable to seize the Suez Canal from Britain in North Africa, making such mass deportations of millions of European Jews impractical. It is unclear when he was informed, but it is evident from surviving statements that Müller was one of the first senior-ranking figures within the Nazi regime to learn during the course of 1941 that a new and horrific approach to the so-called Jewish question had been decided upon by Hitler and others, such as Himmler and Goebbels. What has become known as the final solution, and which led to the Holocaust, would involve the forcible deportation of Europe's Jews into concentration camps located throughout Eastern and Central Europe, though principally in Poland, where they would be murdered by the Nazi regime in massive numbers. Already in the late summer and autumn of 1941, experiments had been carried out at concentration camps such as Auschwitz in western Poland, with gases such as Zyklon B, which would be used to carry out the executions, and the bodies would then be burnt in crematoria located within the camps. Müller had also been kept fully informed of the Einsatzgruppen, or death squads, which had been put into operation throughout Eastern Europe in 1941, and which, over the next 4 years, would be responsible for the murder of upwards of 1.3 million Jews, as well as hundreds of thousands of political prisoners. He was also a leading figure in organizing and overseeing these activities in the months and years that followed. On the 20th of January 1942, Müller attended a conference at Wannsee, a suburb outside Berlin. This was organized by Heydrich and Eichmann, and Müller also played a prominent role. During the course of this, many of the upper echelons of the Nazi Party and the SS, who were in charge of the concentration camp system, were informed about the final solution, which had been developed and resolved upon over the previous 8 months. And from this point onwards, Müller played a very senior role in orchestrating the genocide of Europe's Jews. Much of his work, as it was devolved to him by Himmler, focused on making sure that the evidence of the mass murder which was occurring was covered up by burning the bodies of those who had been killed in the camps, a task which became difficult in camps such as Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the crematoria often could not burn the bodies quickly enough. Despite this problem, he was commanded in 1943 to travel to Italy to force the government of Benito Mussolini there to increase the numbers of Italian Jews who were being deported to the camps to the north and northeast. Ultimately, Müller was, with the likes of Himmler, Heydrich, Eichmann and Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, largely responsible for overseeing the mass murder of Europe's Jews between late 1941 and the end of the war in the summer of 1945. While the final solution was ultimately decided upon by Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, Himmler and others at the very top of the Nazi regime, its actual implementation on a day-to-day basis was largely left to administrators and bureaucrats like Müller, Höss and Eichmann. and the end result of the policy was catastrophic. During the 3-year period between the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 and the period when most of the concentration camps were liberated in the opening weeks and months of 1945, roughly 6 million of Europe's Jews were murdered, either in camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Sobibor and Treblinka, or by being executed by the Einsatzgruppen. Had he ever stood trial after the war, there is little doubt that Müller would have been convicted as one of the most egregious of Germany's war criminals, and also would almost certainly have faced the death penalty for his role in the Holocaust. In the summer of 1942, Müller was sent to Czechoslovakia to oversee a ruthless investigation there. In late 1941, Heydrich had been appointed as an interim governor of the region. He had soon established a reputation for cracking down brutally on any form of political dissent, and he was quickly identified by Britain and the Czechoslovakian resistance movement as a target for assassination. And, as a consequence, some months later, on the 27th of May 1942, in a mission codenamed Operation Anthropoid, Heydrich was attacked on his way to his office near Prague by 2 resistance fighters, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš. Heydrich was badly injured in the attack and died a week later of his wounds, making him the only senior Nazi leader who was successfully assassinated during the Second World War. Müller was quickly dispatched to Prague to investigate, Gabčík and Kubiš having escaped after wounding Heydrich. In an absolutely vicious crackdown in the weeks that followed, Müller not only tracked down and killed the 2 assassins and the resistance fighters who had sheltered them, but carried out reprisals across Czechoslovakia, which resulted in approximately 5,000 deaths, over 13,000 imprisonments, and the effective destruction of the entire villages of Lidice and Ležáky. Heydrich's assassination also changed Müller's position within the security forces. In January 1943, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was appointed as the new head of the Reich Security Main Office in succession to Heydrich. He was now Müller's direct overseer, but Müller evidently exercised greater independence under Kaltenbrunner than he had during Heydrich's day. As a result of these developments, Müller now became arguably the second most senior individual in the implementation of the final solution. As head of the SS, which had overall control of the concentration camps throughout Europe, Himmler was at the top of the pyramid of those who were overseeing the Holocaust. But Müller's role in providing intelligence on the locations and movements of Europe's Jews made him arguably junior only to Himmler in this respect, and senior to figures such as Eichmann, who oversaw the logistics of transferring Europe's Jews to the death camps, and figures such as Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, or Franz Stangl, the commandant of Sobibor and then Treblinka. Consequently, Müller's career as head of the Gestapo in the 1940s is inseparable from his role in the Holocaust. Much of Müller's work between 1943 and 1945 would focus on rooting out conspiracies against the Nazi state. Plans to overthrow Hitler and his accomplices from both within the military and elements of civil society were proliferating during these years, in large part because the war effort had soured, and with it, the chance of Germany coming out victorious in the conflict. After the initial rapid conquest of Ukraine, Belarus, and much of Western Russia in the late summer of autumn of 1941, the German armies had stalled outside St. Petersburg, Moscow and Stalingrad in the winter of 1941, and were decimated in the weeks that followed, without adequate protective clothing in the brutal Russian winter. Efforts in 1942 centered on capturing Stalingrad, but when that failed in the autumn and winter of that year, the tide turned inexorably on the Eastern Front, and the Russians began pushing the Germans back into Ukraine and Belarus in 1943. Elsewhere, the Italians and Germans were expelled from North Africa early in 1943, and a southern front was opened in Italy that summer. Finally, a western front was opened by the US, Britain and the Western Allies in France in the summer of 1944. It was now only a matter of when, not if, the Nazis would be defeated. As this reality dawned in Germany, many groups began plotting ways to overthrow Hitler and the Nazis and tried to negotiate an end to the war with the Allies. Müller was soon dealing with many of these conspiracies, as well as unrest concerning his role as head of the Gestapo. One such episode involved the breaking up of the Solf Circle. This was a group of German intellectuals and academics which had formed around Hanne Solf, the widow of Dr. Wilhelm Solf, a prominent German politician and diplomat during the Second German Reich, and someone who had made his opposition to the Nazis clear in the years before his death in 1936. In the early 1940s, even as the war raged, Hanne Solf held meetings for people who were opposed to Hitler and the Nazis in her salon in Berlin. Although they were not plotting any armed revolt, the circle members had actively tried to protect German Jews and tried to help them escape out of Germany when the Holocaust began. On the 10th of September 1943, a Gestapo agent infiltrated a tea party held by the circle, following which most senior members thereof were arrested. Several were sent to concentration camps, while others suffered torture by Müller's Gestapo and even execution. Then, throughout 1943 and early 1944, Müller also had Gestapo agents arrest thousands of German students who were involved in protest groups such as the White Rose student group and the Swing Youth. Again, although these were largely engaging in non-violent protest, hundreds were tortured or even killed. As pressing as many of these security concerns were for Müller, none threatened the Nazis' grip on power quite so much as one which the head of the Gestapo was charged with investigating in the summer of 1944. What has become known as the 20th of July plot was a conspiracy organized by numerous senior figures within the German army, with the goal of assassinating Hitler and several other senior-ranking members of the regime, and then seizing power. It was hoped that a new military government could then obtain favorable surrender terms from the Allies as quickly as possible. The conspiracy, which was led by the German officer Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and others such as General Friedrich Albrecht, became known as Operation Valkyrie. On the 20th of July 1944, Stauffenberg attended a meeting at Hitler's Wolf's Lair near Rastenburg in eastern Prussia. When he entered, he placed a briefcase filled with explosives under the conference table. He subsequently left to take a pre-arranged telephone call, and it was during his absence that the bomb exploded. However, while there was one fatality and dozens of people were injured in the room, the explosion failed to kill Hitler, possibly because the briefcase was moved after von Stauffenberg left the room. And as a result of this, the 20th of July plot was doomed before it ever really started. After leaving the meeting in the Wolf's Lair, von Stauffenberg quickly headed back to Berlin. Plans for a wider seizure of power in Berlin by the conspirators now kicked in, but with Hitler and the senior commanders having survived, and the plot being quickly uncovered, it all proved abortive. By the end of the day, the plans to seize key buildings in Berlin by Albrecht and von Stauffenberg had failed. Both von Stauffenberg, Albrecht, and several other of the leading rebels were arrested and were executed at approximately 1 a.m. that night, and Müller, as one of the senior Gestapo officials, now came center stage in investigating just how deep the entire conspiracy ran. In the days and weeks that followed, anyone with even the merest hint of an association with the plotters was arrested, over 5,000 people in the end. A very large proportion of these appear to have had little or no knowledge of the plot. Such was the severity with which Müller prosecuted the investigation, that individuals who could not categorically prove their innocence were nevertheless persecuted. Indeed, over 200 of the core plotters were executed. While it was Judge Roland Freisler, the head of the German People's Court, who pronounced sentence on those who were implicated, it was ultimately Müller who decided who ended up in front of this kangaroo court in the late summer and autumn of 1944. Müller was also becoming increasingly fanatical in the final stages of the war. By the winter of 1944, it was plain for all to see that Germany was defeated. The Russians were barreling through Poland and would cross the river Oder into the heartland of Germany early in 1945. More strikingly, the Western Allies were rapidly liberating Western Europe, following the D-Day landings in the summer of 1944, and Paris had been retaken in a short campaign in mid to late August, followed by a further drive eastwards which liberated Brussels and most of Belgium in September. The way was now cleared for a drive into Germany and the Rhineland in the winter of 1944. The only real hope now for Germany was that the Western Allies would have a fatal falling out with Stalin and the Russians before Berlin was captured. Accordingly, the German military command was playing for time and attempted a counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg in December 1944. This proved initially quite successful, but it was at best a delaying tactic, which could have resulted in more favorable peace terms. But Müller seems to have actually believed that the tide of the war was turning again. In the final days of 1944, he is recorded as telling one of his officers in the Gestapo's offices in Berlin that the offensive in the Ardennes would soon push the Western Allies back into France, and Nazi flags would be flying over Paris again in 1945. This was pure fantasy. In the final months of the war, Müller, who had spent much of the war in Berlin, was joined in the capital by a growing number of the senior Nazi officials who had been stationed elsewhere in conquered Europe for several years. He occupied himself in trying to utilize his network of double agents to try to drive divisions between the Allied leaders. Rumors arose at this time that the head of the Gestapo had entered secret negotiations with the Soviet secret services, but this is implausible. One of the few genuine political beliefs Müller had was his hatred of the Soviet regime, and the rumors seem to have been entirely fabricated by a rival for power within the Reich security main office, Walter Schellenberg. Yet the rumor would fuel later theories that Müller was taken into custody and protected by the Russians at the end of the war. Müller was one of the officials at Hitler's bunker in central Berlin in the final days of April. He is recorded as being seen there on the 30th of April, shortly before Hitler killed himself that day, and there is also a report of him being in the vicinity the next day when Goebbels, the Führer's successor, also committed suicide. The following day, the Battle of Berlin ended when General Helmut Weidling surrendered to the Russians. Following Germany's surrender and the declaration of the end of the war on the 8th of May 1945, the arduous process of identifying, arresting and prosecuting the leading members of the Nazi regime and those who were guilty of having committed war crimes was initiated by the Allies, and given its central role in the Holocaust, the maintenance of the totalitarian state and the torture and execution of thousands of political prisoners over the years, members of the Gestapo were foremost amongst those who were prosecuted by the Allies. The Gestapo itself had ceased to exist with the end of the Nazi regime and had been branded by the Allies as a criminal organization. When an international military tribunal was established by the Allies in November 1945, it identified three key groups within Germany as those which needed to be held accountable for their conduct during the war, and these were the senior membership of the Nazi Party, the SS, and the Gestapo. And individuals who were tried in the Nuremberg trials which followed, and who had been members of the Gestapo, including Göring, Kaltenbrunner, and the Austrian Nazi leader, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. But Müller would never be tried or convicted, as in May 1945, as the war was entering its final days and hours, the head of the Gestapo had simply vanished. Müller was last seen on the evening of the 1st of May 1945. It was that evening that Hitler's designated successor, Joseph Goebbels, committed suicide, leaving the Nazi regime leaderless. Müller had been overheard to say at this time that he had no intention of being captured alive by the Russians. As the head of an agency which had persecuted Russian sympathizers and Russian prisoners of war, Müller had more reason than most to be fearful of what would happen to him. Thus, he vanished right around the time of Goebbels' suicide, though there are unsubstantiated claims that he was with Himmler near the Danish border on the 11th of May, shortly before the head of the SS's capture just over a week later. No trace of his whereabouts had been detected by the Allies weeks later, but Müller had been listed by the Allies as a person of major interest and one who would stand trial at Nuremberg for his actions if captured. Accordingly, on the 27th of May 1945, the Counterintelligence War Room listed him amongst its priority targets who were still not apprehended. Despite concerted investigations in the weeks and months that followed, Müller remained missing. His disappearance made him the most senior figure in the Nazi regime, whose location could not be determined. Müller would never be located, but the abrupt manner of his disappearance has sparked numerous theories as to what happened to him ever since. One of the most popular, driven in large part by Schellenberg's earlier claims that Müller had been involved in negotiations with the Soviets towards the end of the war, was that he was captured by the Russians shortly after the fall of Berlin and taken into secret protective custody in the aftermath of the war. This theory was further fueled by unsubstantiated claims that Müller had been seen in Moscow and elsewhere in the years following the war. Another theory, which was given fresh interest in the early 1960s following the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, was that Müller had, like many other Nazis, fled to South America in the aftermath of the war. Nazi war criminals had been given protection here by the administration of Juan Perón in the aftermath of the war, and as a result of this renewed speculation, investigations were carried out throughout Latin America in the 1960s to locate Müller, resulting eventually in the identification of a suspect, a Francis Keith Willard, who was living in Panama City and was briefly believed to be Müller. Fingerprint analysis eventually revealed that there was no basis to this theory, and there is no evidence to this day to suggest that Müller ended up in Latin America after the war. Many investigations were subsequently undertaken to both locate Müller and to determine exactly what had happened to him in 1945. For instance, Eichmann's arrest and trial in the early 1960s triggered fresh investigations by both the Israeli government and that of West Germany. Then, in 1999, the US Central Intelligence Agency threw open its records on Müller for fresh examination. These were largely contradictory. Some contained reports which seemed to suggest that Müller had died shortly after the war. Others contained reports from informants in the 1950s and 1960s which speculated that he had indeed defected to the Russians, while others still suggested that Müller might have been at large as late as the 1960s. An independent report produced by a committee of historians and other figures at the time concluded that, while they could not say definitively what had happened to Müller, it seemed likely that the US government had not harbored him, a theory which Russian counterintelligence agencies had tried to promote during the Cold War. The mystery of Müller's disappearance was further added to in 2013 when the head of the Memorial for Jewish Resistance in Berlin, Johannes Tuchel, issued a statement which asserted that Müller had died or been killed shortly after the German surrender in May 1945. His body, Tuchel claimed, had been buried in a mass grave with around 2,500 others at the Jewish cemetery in the Mitte district of Berlin, and had been discovered there by Allied investigators in August 1945. This claim was further substantiated through newly discovered documents which indicated that the supposed location of Müller's body was in fact identified by Allied investigators at the time. Tuchel further claimed that Müller had been recorded as still wearing his police uniform, and his ID was found on his person. It has not proved possible to corroborate Tuchel's claims, as Jewish religious laws prohibit the exhumation of bodies. But, if true, this would seem to make it clear that the head of the Gestapo throughout the Second World War was killed or committed suicide shortly after he was last seen in Hitler's bunker on the 1st of May 1945. The truth, though, is that with the passage of over 75 years, and numerous investigations, we will almost certainly never know for sure what happened to Müller, whether he died in 1945, was taken into custody by the Russians, fled to South America, or ended up somewhere else. His fate remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Second World War. Of all the leading figures within the Nazi regime and the Third Reich, Heinrich Müller was surely one of the most reprehensible. He was seemingly possessed of no interests or personality beyond the meticulous investigative and bureaucratic work which he undertook around the clock from the moment he joined the Gestapo in 1934 down to the end of the war 11 years later. But politically, he was something of an enigma. Earlier in his career, he had been involved in investigating Hitler and the nascent Nazi Party in Bavaria, following the botched Munich Putsch in November 1923. Moreover, he was affiliated with the Bavarian People's Party in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and even advised the regional government in Munich to resist the Nazis when they were seizing power in 1933. In the end, he only survived and prospered within the Gestapo as a result of Heydrich's personal patronage, and he resisted joining the Nazi Party himself until 1939, when it became a prerequisite to his succeeding Heydrich as head of the Gestapo. Thus we are left with a lukewarm Nazi, one who seems more to have been politically malleable if it suited his career ambitions. Yet, whatever Müller's own political leanings were, they made little difference in mitigating the violence of his actions. Müller was one of the figures within Nazi Germany who was most responsible for the persecution and bloodshed which was unleashed between 1939 and 1945. As head of the Gestapo, he systematically rooted out any perceived opponents of the regime, be they left-leaning communist sympathizers or anti-war student protesters. A great many suffered arrest, torture, imprisonment, or even death, sometimes for relatively minor offences, and the brutal manner in which Müller oversaw the repercussions in Czechoslovakia following Heydrich's murder in 1942 is symptomatic of Müller's methods. But it was ultimately his role in the Holocaust with which Müller will be lastingly associated. From as early as Kristallnacht in 1938, Müller was playing a significant role in the persecution of Europe's Jews, and this expanded very considerably in the years that followed. His centrality to the Holocaust, which it led to, is evinced both by his having been one of the first senior German officials to be informed of the final solution in 1941, and his key role in the Wannsee Conference of January 1942. Ultimately, the mysterious circumstances of his disappearance in 1945 are somewhat unfortunate, as they ensured that Müller was never to stand trial for his crimes at Nuremberg. What do you think of Heinrich Müller? How significant a figure do you think he was in orchestrating the Holocaust? And what do you think happened to him following his disappearance in 1945? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.